So we're on section 3 of chapter 2, and it's by far the toughest one. We're going through the cycling of matter in an ecosystem. We've talked about the organisms, we've talked about the energy, and now we're going to talk about the cycles. It's important to recognize at this point that energy in an ecosystem is a one-way proposition. It goes from the sun and it enters our biosphere, and it gets lost as heat in each step of the transformations that occur there, but it never does get recycled. We have to have a constant energy source, which is the sun, to fuel our ecosystems. Matter is a different proposition. Matter is recycled, and we'll talk about how it's recycled in several different ways in this section. Your objectives are to recognize this recycling. First of all, is to recognize that atoms and molecules cycle among the living and non-living components of the biosphere. 2, explain the importance of nutrients to living organisms, and these nutrients are those atoms and molecules in number 1. Recognize how earth materials move through geochemical cycles, also called biogeochemical cycles, really the same thing. The carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the oxygen cycle, and there's also a phosphorus cycle in there that we'll talk about, and the water cycle too. So all of those are kind of part of this. And then it results in chemical and physical changes in matter that have impact on your ecosystems. And then number 4, analyze factors which may influence environmental quality. When these cycles get thrown off in a part of the ecosystem, you get pretty bad things that can happen. So you need to be able to recognize some of those. So, biogeochemical cycles. The word bio is life. These are Greek words usually. Geo means earth, and chemical, which means matter. So biogeochemical means the cycling of matter through life and the earth, and the matter is going from living things to the non-living parts of the ecosystem and back again over and over again. We're going to talk about 4 important examples here: the water cycle, the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. Water cycle obviously will be the easiest, and then they kind of get harder from there. Water cycle first. There are 6 key words that you need to remember for water cycle, and you have learned these since, oh heavens, like 2nd grade, right? Evaporation is changing from a liquid to a gas. Condensation is gas to a liquid. Precipitation is where you're going to get liquid or solid water from the clouds down to the ground. Transpiration might be a new one for you. It's when water is evaporating out of plant leaves. And that's an important one to remember. It's actually a major source of water being returned to the atmosphere. And then groundwater is where you've got underground reserves of water in soil, in crevices, in aquifers like the Ogallala Aquifer. That refers to groundwater. And then runoff, where the water doesn't go into the ground but runs toward lower areas. Through rivers, streams, and down into lakes and even ocean runoff. Okay, so going through a little diagram here, you can fill in whatever there might be blank on your copy of this as we go, and feel free to pause, go back over anything if it doesn't make sense. Water cycle, that might not be a big deal, but the others it might. So we are going to kind of start in the atmosphere, but recognize that because this is a cycle, there's no beginning or end. So we start out with water as a gas in the atmosphere, and it condenses into clouds. And the way that condensation into clouds works is there are little dust particles floating in the air, and the water sticks to it and lowers in temperature, and so the buildup of these little gas particles, water particles, forms these bigger droplets that eventually get heavy and fall to Earth in precipitation. And so you get rain, snow, you get waters that go into rivers and lakes, or it percolates. Percolating means kind of dripping down through the soil into groundwater sources, or it can end up in the ocean directly or through runoff. Also, as the plants are kind of picking up water, they're doing photosynthesis, some of the water, in fact, a lot of the water is lost out through the leaves and things through transpiration. So that's one way that it goes back into the atmosphere. And of course, the other way it goes back into the atmosphere is through evaporation. So that's the gist of how things are going. There's obviously the flow of the rivers to the sea. So there's the water cycle for you. You can pause at this point if you need to and go back through it if you have to, but that's pretty straightforward stuff. All right. Now, a couple things about water to remember. Water does make a huge difference, and all the water that's ever been on the earth is pretty much still here. Water gets cycled over and over again. We don't have any new sources of water from outer space. And water doesn't float away into the into outer space. It gets recycled. It might be changed into other atoms or other molecules, not atoms, but might get rearranged and reformed. But it's basically still all here. 90% of water vapor evaporates from oceans, lakes, and rivers. 10% of it gets out through transpiration, like I talked about. Fresh water is only about 3% of all of our water. And of that 3%, 69% of the fresh water is found in ice caps and glaciers. And why is fresh water important? Well, that's the kind that humans like us can use. We have to take the salt out of ocean water for it to be of use to us because it dehydrates our body if we try to drink it in its original form, or its saltwater form anyway. And so here's a kind of a diagram of the, you've got oceans make up 97% of the water on the earth. The fresh water is just this tiny little bit. Of that tiny little bit, most of it is in the ice caps and glaciers. 20% of it is in groundwater, and we actually only have 1% of our water that's accessible to us at any given time, and that's in the form of lakes, rivers, living inside of organisms, soil moisture, and water vapor. So we really don't have all that many sources of accessible fresh water. We have to kind of be careful about that, using our water wisely and not making sure we're being wasteful. Okay, so it's important to note that like I said before, things are being recycled. The matter on Earth has been here for billions of years, 4.5 billion years to be more or less exact. We're not exact about it, but it's been broken apart and reformed. Water's constantly breaking apart and reforming, and also solidifying, liquefying, and vaporizing, and back and forth, all of those many times. Okay, so that's water cycle. Keywords for carbon and oxygen cycles. We're going to go through those next. Carbon is sometimes separated out from oxygen, but they're really interrelated because they're a lot of the same molecules. So, photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the consuming of CO2 and water to make sugar and oxygen. So you can see right there, there's O2 in both of those parts. The C, that's going to go into the sugars and get eaten, and then it goes back into the atmosphere in different ways. Respiration is the opposite of photosynthesis. You consume the oxygen, you produce the CO2 and water. Deposition. This is where we get material like dead organisms building up on the land or at the bottom of oceans and lakes, and that becomes important later when we take that out and say burn it or get the carbon out of it in other ways. This is fossil fuels. This is where this comes in. Natural fuel formed from the remains of organisms. We burn it and we put CO2 back into the atmosphere doing that. And then combustion is that burning process that I just mentioned. It produces CO2 by burning the fossil fuels or by burning wood. Okay, so in the carbon and oxygen cycle, this is where we need these these molecules to build up bigger molecules that we need for life. We're talking about anabolism, making the bigger molecules so that they then get broken down, and catabolism, if you remember way back in chapter 6. So the four things that we need for life are proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and carbon dioxide is in there, but actually the four the four with one should be DNA. But yeah, it's okay. Carbon and oxygen recycle quickly through living organisms, through photosynthesis, and through respiration. And this is kind of a short-term part of the carbon and oxygen cycle. This is kind of how this looks. Okay, starting within the atmosphere again. You got carbon dioxide floating around. Not very much of the atmosphere is made of carbon dioxide, just less than 1% of it is. And so you get two things that just appeared here. We have photosynthesis, which is putting the carbon into the plants. And there's also a little bit of an exchange between the atmosphere and water. CO2 ends up dissolving into water as carbonate or carbonic acid. And so that at that point it can be used by algae and plants for that photosynthesis there too, and a little bit different process. It enters the food chain at this point where plant eaters go ahead and eat that carbon up and use it to make their own important molecules. And then they breathe out the carbon dioxide again, and so you've got some short-term cycling. The carbon goes in and the carbon comes out. It goes in and out. You also have not just it being exhaled, but you've got a lot of carbon just being stored in these living organisms. And so when they die, they sit on the ground and they decay, and some of them get eaten by other things, but some of them just sit there. And so when you've got things being decayed and decomposed, the microbes that are feeding on these also are doing respiration and return some of that CO2 into the atmosphere. And in addition to that, just sitting around is going to end up making it into a fossil fuel eventually if it stays there without decomposing over the long term, or if it gets pressurized, things like that. So you've got carbon and fossil fuels. This happens a lot in swampy areas. You get lots and lots of layers of the organic material being covered up really fast, and so that's common in swampy areas. We don't have a whole lot of that going on right now. But when we burn those fossil fuels, it ends up returning the CO2 into the atmosphere, and we're back where we started. All right, so that's the carbon and oxygen cycle. Take a moment to breathe all that in, literally. The long-term aspect of this is important to understand. Carbon cycles over the long-term time scale in two different ways. We've got, like I talked about, the organic matter that gets turned into peat, coal, oil, gas deposits, and it just sits there for millions of years. And so that's considered a long-term storage part of the cycle. And then there's also calcium carbonate, where the carbon is bound up in limestone deposits. And these limestone deposits are made by clams, coral, oysters, and it's stuck in their shells. And once it's stuck in there, it takes a really long time for it to get out. It has to be dissolved out by different chemical compounds and stuff. So that's long-term ways that carbon stays around. The short-term is, like I mentioned, the photosynthesis, the respiration, decomposition. Those are relatively quick things. Burning the fossil fuels is a transition from taking it out of long-term storage and putting it back into the short term. Okay, so make sure you understand that aspect of it. Now, this is the nitrogen cycle, and at this point you can stop and take a breather if you want. I'm not going to. I'm going to keep on going, so it makes it kind of a long video, I know, but take a breather. This one's a big one. The nitrogen cycle. Okay, so this is a good overall picture of it, but there's a step-by-step that's going to come in here. But what's important to understand is 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen, and all of it is completely inaccessible to us in its atmospheric form. We cannot take in atmospheric nitrogen into our bodies directly and have it do anything for us, and yet we need it. So we have to have some way to get it into the organic part of the cycle. So here's how that works. We'll kind of start with this. We've got, your little bunny rabbit, or you can put yourself in this situation also. We eat plants that already have nitrogen in them. Okay, well, they obviously had to get the nitrogen somehow, but we're starting here. Remember, it's a cycle, so it's going to come back around. Now, when we die, or the little bunny rabbit dies, decomposers break down the wastes and the remains, and they return the nitrogen compounds to the soil. Okay, so there's nitrogen in the soil. Bacteria play a huge part in the nitrogen cycle, and what they do is they release the nitrogen that's in the soil back into the air. And so there's our nitrogen in the air again, like I mentioned before. And here's the really important part. We have to get this back into a usable form when we need it. And what happens here is, in this part, there are certain bacteria that live on the roots of some plants that will take the nitrogen out of the air, and they will turn it into ammonium-related compounds that we need. And so these are nitrogen-related compounds that we need. These little bumps here are these nodules that have the bacteria that are needed to do this nitrogen work. All right, and this is a little bit of another overview of it, but it's the same sort of information. Plants get nitrogen from the soil, consumers eat it. Nitrogen compounds return to the soil from waste, decomposition. Your pea has nitrogen in it. Some nitrogen goes back to the air. This has a name. We'll talk about that in a second. And then bacteria fixes the atmospheric nitrogen for use by the plants. And so it goes around and around like this. And there's some vocabulary associated with this that you need to understand. All right. First of all, the nitrogen gas being called free nitrogen. Okay, this is the most common form of nitrogen. Like I said, your air is just chock full of it. It's N2 because it's two nitrogen atoms bonded together. It cannot be used by organisms in that way, so it has to be converted to usable form. That's where these little root nodules come in. Soybeans have this. Lots of bean types have it. If you're familiar with soybean roots, that's what they kind of look like. Nitrogen fixation is the name of the process where we take the nitrogen from the air and turn it into something useful. Those little bacteria are doing that for us all the time. So nitrogen fixation is a vocabulary word you need to understand. Taking the nitrogen, fixing it for our use. And then the fixed nitrogen gets to go into the food web and the food chain when plants are absorbing the compounds and when consumers then eat them. It's used by organisms to build proteins primarily, and a few other things here and there. Now, when we get rid of this, it eventually it can cycle through the soil over and over again and back into plants, but it does eventually also get put into nitrogen gas again if the bacteria break it down and take it from its kind of organic, useful forms and put it back into nitrogen gas. So the bacteria are really important in this cycle because not only are they fixing the nitrogen so that we can use it, they're putting it back into the atmosphere also. Really, really important parts of this process. Denitrification is the word that refers to going back into the atmosphere. And that happens after animals pee it out, organisms die, organisms convert ammonia into nitrogen compounds, and then you get denitrification, going back into the atmosphere. So nitrogen fixation, taking it out of the atmosphere, denitrification, putting it back into the atmosphere. Keep those straight. Last one, phosphorus. Phosphorus is also a huge component of our body systems, and if you remember, we have a phosphorus in use a lot by ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so you're using phosphate all of the time, every minute and every second of every day. You're just using this stuff all the time. It's also a backbone of our DNA, so really important stuff, this phosphorus. It's got a short-term and a long-term aspect of the cycle. Unlike the other cycles, this one does not go through the atmosphere. Phosphorus is not in our atmosphere at all. So that's an interesting piece of this one. Phosphorus is cycled from soil to producers to consumers in the short term. In the long term, it gets bound up in rocks. And so the weathering of or erosion of rocks can slowly add the phosphorus back into the short-term cycle, but it gets stuck there for a long time. So this is kind of what this looks like. Remember, there's no atmosphere in the phosphorus cycle, but you've got what we call soluble, which means dissolvable phosphate molecules, those PO4s or PO3s that are ions, basically, that can be bound to other things and they can be dissolved in water. So they're in the soil and they get kind of drained or lost into the water, and so they're in solution now. They're kind of ions that are bouncing around in the water, and they eventually kind of precipitate out, and precipitate is a word I'll come back to. But you'll have them settle down into the bottom, into the sediment down here. So you get phosphate ions and phosphate molecules in the sediment. And then the roots take it into the plants, and then it's going to enter our food chain at that point. Okay, so the phosphates go into the plant tissues, and then they go into the animal tissues that way, and then they get peed or pooed out, and then you've got them back in the water. So there's kind of the aqua part of the phosphorus cycle, but it can also happen and cycle on land, where you've got the phosphorus being taken up by plants and then eaten by animals and then excreted back and decomposed back into phosphates in the soil. So you've got a land portion and you've got a water portion, and then remember you've got the long term and short term of it also, where you've got things that can get bound up in rocks for a long, long time. And then when they're bound up in the rocks, they weather and they can come back into the short term cycle. Okay, so phosphorus cycle, take it all in. All right, why does it matter? It's the second most common mineral in the body after calcium. I bet you didn't know that. It's used to build DNA. It's used to build the molecules that store energy, ATP. It's also found in your bones and teeth, so quite important. Some keywords to remember. Solution is when there is a mixture of substances. In this case, we're talking about water mixing with phosphates, kind of like salt water, except for instead of salt, it's phosphate water. Phosphates are phosphorus-containing compounds that dissolve in the water. Precipitation is when a solid forms out of this solution. So you've got some things dissolved and then solids come out of it. It's kind of a weird concept, but that's what precipitation means in this case. We're not talking about the same precipitation as when things rain. Different meaning of the word, so be careful on that one. And phosphorus doesn't cycle through the atmosphere. I mentioned that before, so just something to keep in mind. At that point, I'm going to end it here, and please ask me if you have questions. Rewatch. You need to understand these. This is a big one, so take your time with it. Make sure you do what you need to do to learn it, and good luck. See you in class.